Please be seated. But Jesus did not answer her at all. A couple weeks ago, a newspaper in Minnesota published a short obituary of a man named Brian Eldridge, which was written by his brother. May 1947, July 2023. Brian was a quiet, shy boy and man. He was bullied as a child and teenager because of his shyness and vulnerability. As an adult, he didn't fit in. He never learned to use a computer or a cell phone, which kept him from applying for most jobs. He worked and supported himself through paper routes, aluminum can recycling, and janitorial work. He was exploited by employers. His last job was cleaning a bingo hall at midnight for $10 an hour, 7 nights a week, 364 days a year, with just less than the minimum weekly hours to have any rights or benefits. His employer fired him on Christmas Eve with no notice. He had worked there for 15 years. He had no friends or family who kept up with him. He was quiet, smart, generous, and lonely. When found in his apartment, he had been dead at least 4 days. I'll miss him. It is Jesus' first response to the Canaanite woman in today's gospel that I find so difficult. Now, for the second response, when Jesus says, it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs, there's a way to lessen the sting. The word that Jesus uses for dog in this passage is actually the diminutive, and it might better be translated as pet. So Jesus is not comparing the woman to a dog. Instead, he is saying we have to feed our own people first, the children, before we feed the outsiders, the household pets. Charity begins at home. No, it is this first response that I find most objectionable. A woman comes to Jesus and asks him to heal her daughter who is suffering, and Jesus totally ignores her. In Greek, it says that he did not answer her a word. And that is significant because just a few sentences before, in verse 12, the disciples tell Jesus, "Do you know that the Pharisees, having heard the word, took offense?" And so to his theological enemies who are plotting to kill him, Jesus has spoken the word to them. While he may disagree with their theology, he respects the Pharisees enough to at least engage with them. But to this woman who just wants healing for her daughter, Jesus' response is to withhold the word that he freely gives to the Pharisees, to say nothing, to treat her as invisible. In response to a reporter, the man who wrote the obituary for his brother, Steve Eldridge, expressed frustration that no one ever spoke to Brian. Why didn't anyone find out his name? It's not like he had any friends or anyone invited him anywhere or even talked to him. And in describing his motivation for writing the obituary, he said, "I just wanted people to meet my brother and maybe empathize with him and to say to themselves, could I have met him, known him, introduced myself, talked to him, or somehow maintained contact to the point where we wouldn't have discovered his dead body after God knows how long, because nobody cared." Nobody in Israel cared for the Canaanites. They were part of the indigenous people in the land of Israel, among its original inhabitants who were displaced forcibly and then forever after despised by the Israelites. In fact, there are passages in the Bible that tell the Israelites to separate themselves from the Canaanites, to not let their children marry them, not to mix with them. They were to have a segregated society. No wonder the disciples wanted Jesus to send the Canaanite woman away. No wonder Jesus didn't say anything to her. But the story doesn't end there. Silence does not have the last word. The Canaanite woman does not let herself be ignored. She makes Jesus notice her and the suffering of her daughter. And when Jesus finally sees her, he no longer withholds the word, but he grants it. The word that brings new life and healing to her suffering daughter. Brian Eldridge's brother, Steve, was determined to make Brian's life visible, to make us notice him. The obituary went viral. After reading it, hundreds of people from all over the world wrote comments. Brian ceased to be invisible, and when people finally noticed him, they responded with words. Words of empathy, words of self-criticism that we live in a society that can ignore people this way. Words of hope that Brian is now surrounded by love. It's not only people like Brian who are invisible among us, whose suffering we don't see. There are so many, almost too many to count. There are the homeless who are so easy to miss every day. There are the victims of domestic violence, too afraid to leave or to speak up. There are the high-functioning addicts who hide their alcoholism or drug abuse by being really great at their jobs. And there are those affluent families who are drowning in debt, trying to keep up appearances, and who are so close to having it all crash down. To all of them, and to all of us, when our suffering has been ignored, when we are made to be invisible, our gospel story promises good news. Silence does not have the last word. Not the silence imposed by an oppression rooted in history, theology, and politics. Not the silence when someone completely ignores our humanity, even if that person happens to be literally Jesus Christ. Not even the silence of death. Silence does not have the last word. That is both a promise and a call to action. The Canaanite woman made her daughter's invisible suffering visible to Jesus. Steve Eldridge refused to let his brother's life be ignored and forgotten. And when they were finally seen, the silence was broken, and the word was no longer withheld, but it was granted. The same is true for us. Silence does not have the last word. That is a promise and a call to action. Who are the invisible among us, whom we can make visible? The ones whose suffering has been ignored, to whom we can bring the word of life. Silence does not have the last word. That is a promise and a call to action.